Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unstoppable Mindset. Today, we get the opportunity and the honor of chatting with Heather Christie. And Heather is an author. She and her brother have formed a company, so she's clearly an entrepreneur. She's acted. She's a keynote speaker, and I don't know what all. We're going to find out in the next hour or so. But definitely an exciting person to get a chance to chat with. So, Heather, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. We're glad you're here.
Thank you, Michael. I'm so honored that we're going to have a conversation today.
And Heather lives in New York City. She lives in Manhattan, or as we all know it, the city.
That's right.
And before we started this, we were talking about the fact that winter is coming everywhere. Well, what do you do? As long as you don't get too much snow back there.
Yeah, the winters have been pretty mild here the last couple of years, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, time will tell. Well, why don't we start? Tell us about the early Heather growing up and some of those things.
Okay, well, as a young person, I wanted to be an actress, and I grew up in a really small rural town, about 2 hours due west of New York City in Pennsylvania. It's called the Ole Valley.
What town?
Oh, it's called Ole Valley. It's actually a
Ole
national
Valley. Okay.
historic site. And so I had a really interesting sort of upbringing because before it was really in vogue, I was on a work study program and I would spend half my day in this small Pennsylvania town. And then I would jump on a bus. It was called the Beaver bus back then, and drive to New York City on the bus. And that was like 2 to 2.5 hours each way. Get off in the, huge metropolis of New York City, go on auditions, go-sees, or if I had a booking, I'd do the booking. And then I would jump back on the bus and go all the way back to rural Pennsylvania. And that's how I spent like all my high school years, was back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then I actually graduated early. I graduated halfway through my senior year. I had enough of my credits done that I'd actually... The first half of my senior year, I went to community college and I took a class in the evenings so I could be done by Christmas break. And the only requirement I still needed to fulfill was my physical fitness. So I ended up moving to New York City, and then I would take my physical fitness classes at Steps Dance Studio. And then I was still able to graduate with my class in June, but I was living in New York City from January on of what would have been senior year. Yeah. So that was like the early me. And the one thing that was sort of interesting, when I was on the work study, my mom was a mathematician and my dad was an ER doctor. So they actually tutored me. My mom tutored me in math and my father tutored me in chemistry. And then like my history teacher back in the day, we had Walkmans and he would record his history lessons on a Walkman and I would listen to them on the bus back and forth from New York.
Yep. Walkmans were the big thing back in time. Sony created a very clever thing, but as with everything, the technology has advanced beyond that now.
That's right. Yeah. Now my kids wouldn't even recognize a Walkman.
They wouldn't recognize a cassette either.
That's right. Yeah, it would be like an ancient artifact.
What's really strange is there are a lot of people who don't even really know anymore what CDs are.
That's true. Yeah.
Much less, well, and DVD is sort of going the same way. It hasn't quite got there, but we are now moving more into streaming and things like that. But gee, what a crazy world. Well, so you went through high school basically commuting to New York. What did your parents think of that?
Well, I was one of four children. I was the oldest child. And what's remarkable is in the beginning, my mother would go with me. But it was hard to do that and have, three other children at home. So by the time I was 15, I was doing it on my own. And it's just like such a different culture that children are raised in now. There's sort of this idea that we can't let them kind of do their own thing. We're so follow every move and thing they do. But there was like a lot of independence my parents granted me at such a young age. And so they thought, I mean, it was great. And they gave me the support I needed. But at the same time, they allowed me to be really independent at a pretty young age. I know when I tell people, oh, yeah, I moved to New York City when I was 17 by myself, they're like, and your parents let you do that? And New York, and this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And New York was like a whole different place. Like when I get off the bus at Port Authority back then, like now that whole strip, Times Square is kind of sanitized and Disneyfied. But back then it was a little rough.
It was a lot of X-rated things and all that. I did some commuting more in the early 90s. I sold products and I would travel back to New York because that's where I sold to. I traveled from California. And I remember there was a lot of stuff on 42nd Street that was very X-rated and so on. A lot different than the musical 42nd Street, but that's okay.
That's right, yeah.
But it is a lot cleaner now than it was. And I remember times I would go out of my hotel and there would be people who would say, you really shouldn't be walking around on your own. And why not? And they said, well, because it's pretty dangerous here. And, you know, the angels that were out there insisted on escorting me everywhere I went just because they were concerned about me. And I wasn't, although I understand the situation, but I wasn't going to go in the middle of Central Park at night either. So, you know.
Right. It was a lot the same for me. Yeah. I remember though, I would get off the bus at the Port Authority. For people who know New York City, it's on 8th Avenue. And then I would feel like I wasn't like fully safe until I could get to Lord and Taylor, which was on 6th Avenue.
Yeah.
And then it felt like everything got a little bit safer and calmer. The energy changed.
Yeah.
But
it was a lot different. You could always go to St. Patrick's Cathedral for refuge too. So, but yeah, the Port Authority was an interesting place to go, and I understand. Well, how did all of that affect you, and how does what you did back then kind of affect you in the way you think today, especially with children and so on? Would you give them that same level of independence today?
That's a really interesting question. And my children are a little older than I was at that time now. But I do think about when they were 15, 16, 17 years old. And if I'm to answer the question really honestly, I don't know that I would have. I just feel like, and I don't know what's changed about society that makes it that way, and part of it, I think, is maybe like the news cycle just is constantly highlighting everything that's wrong and it's fear-based, that's what we see, and it's in our faces so much more because we have all of this access to it through social media, that it creates sort of this like undercurrent in parenting that we're oftentimes afraid, like what could happen to our children. So I don't know if I actually would have let them commute like that by themselves, you know, like, yeah, I don't think I would have.
Yeah, it's definitely different now than it was then. And I think you're right with especially the news cycle. And also in reality, there's so much gun violence and other stuff going on. And I ask people when we talk about it, I ask, is it really that there's more now, or it's just more visible in the news? And I'm not sure that it's just visibility. I think there is more stuff going on, and it's not being stopped nearly as effectively or as aggressively as it should be. And it does make it a scarier world. It's tougher, I think, by far to be a kid now than it was when you were a kid, much less, I believe, when I was growing up. We just didn't see the kinds of things that we see today. And I don't think it's all just exposure from the news. I think there's some truth to the fact that there are other issues going on.
Right, that it actually is a more dangerous world that we live in.
Yeah. And I think that it is something that we do have to think about And hopefully someday sanity will come back to it all. I'm
Agreed.
I'm of the opinion that eventually it will, but so that's cool. But still we have to do what we do. But I also think that we can't stifle our children. We have to give them the opportunity to grow. It may be that you might, when your children were the age you were, you might have decided, well, one of us just has to go with you all the time. And we're going to just to keep an eye on you, or you have other people that help. But I think being so aggressively smothering that you don't let children grow is a problem too.
Yeah, I agree. I think I mean, there's that saying, and maybe I'll get it right or maybe I'll get it wrong here, that we need to give our children roots and wings.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's the challenge, is to find the balance.
Yeah. Well, and so for you, you were given a lot of independence. How did that shape kind of your attitude, and how does it shape the way you look at life today?
Well, that's a really great question. And for all the independence that I had as a young person, and maybe I was given too much independence in some ways, because I ended up marrying very young. And I often wonder, like, had my parents not given me as much independence, if I would have done that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I still think I'm very independent now, and I've tried to instill that in my children as well. And I think they're really great kids, and they've launched really well, which I know is a common problem with today's young adults, is the sort of inability to launch. And I feel really good. Both my kids have done that and done it well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and all you can do is your best.
Right.
I think we don't do this nearly as much as we should, but it ultimately comes down to, kids want all sorts of independence and so on. Parents and I'm talking about parents who really think about what they do. They may not want children to have that much independence, but I think the key is that you really need to communicate with your kids and teach them what's going on and why.
Right. I think it's to be open and transparent with our children is very important. And to have, like, the hard conversations, and give them a safe space in which they can speak to.
The other side of that is that we should hold them to the same standard and say, when you have issues and so on, we're here. We're not going to judge you. You need to have the hard conversations with us too. And I don't think we do nearly as much of that. I know when I was growing up, we had a lot of conversations. Of course, I was blind. I've been blind my whole life. And I encountered a lot of different things growing up. And my parents were glad to talk with me about blindness and glad to talk with me about different things about independence. And it also was true that they allowed me to be independent. I mean, I rode my own bike around the neighborhood, and I'm not the only blind kid that did that in the world, but in my town I was.
Right.
And I think that, I'm sure that I was watched, but parents didn't interfere. I mean, I even fell off the bike a couple times until I really learned how to ride it. But they allowed me to have the opportunity to grow. And I think that there is a way to do that without stifling your kids, and that you can let kids grow. And we should really emphasize curiosity a lot more than we do.
I agree. I think that's really important, is to give kids the space to grow and encourage curiosity.
Yeah. We don't probably do that nearly as much as we ought to. Well, so you mentioned you got married at 19. Well, I guess that's a little young. But you did that, huh?
I did. Yes. I did. I married young.
How did that work out?
Well, it worked out for a little. Well, it worked out for a while. I stayed married a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
but I eventually divorced 30 years later. And part of that had to do with I was I did marry young, but my ex-husband also had some addictions that,
Mm.
in time just became too hard to manage. So that ended the
And
union.
he wouldn't deal with them.
Well, at one point, I mean, well, as a lot of times in relationship with addicts, there are times when they deal with them and then when they don't.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
ultimately it dissolved.
It's too bad, but things happen.
That's right. Yeah. But I'm grateful for the union because it produced my two great kids.
And what else did being married for 30 years teach you?
Well, wow, that's a great question. I think probably it taught me most of all, it's a lesson learned, sort of, that you really need to be true to yourself and listen to yourself. Because I think deep down we know. Um, and I was always trying like to try harder. If I just try harder, things will get better. But there was part of me deep down that knew I was sort of um, trying harder for everybody else but myself.
Mm.
And when I left New York, I had given up everything I'd worked on. And in hindsight, when I look back, it was in a way I sort of abandoned all my dreams and hopes. And ultimately, I don't think that's a good thing when you give up yourself for someone else.
So after you got married, what did you do? Where did you go?
Well, my ex-husband was a professional soccer player, so we
Ah,
ended up going around the United States. He played for a couple different teams, and I went to college and I finished my degree at the University of Texas, and then I did a couple of things. I was a flight attendant, and I eventually fell into real estate and worked in real estate for a long, long time. But along the way, there was a point where I kind of really missed that young creative person that I had started out my life as. And I'd always loved books and literature, and my undergraduate degree was in literary studies. And I started writing stories. And then at midlife, went back to graduate school for a master's of fine arts in creative writing and started writing. So I was always doing a bunch of things. I was a real estate broker, I was managing a company, and then I was writing and began writing novels on the side.
what was your bachelor's degree in?
Literary studies.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you never did get degrees in what either of your parents did.
No, 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 no.
You weren't that into math.
No, not at all. No, I always liked words,
Yeah, I
stories.
understand. I do pretty well with math, but I by the same token, I've been learning more about words, having now written 3 books and appreciate it. I also like to collaborate. So when I write, I generally write with someone. I think that the team approach works. At least it does for me. And there are a lot of people who don't use a second person on their team other than their publishers, editors, and so on. But for me, the collaborative way works, which is fine.
I've had a little bit more experience later now in my creative career because and maybe we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I've started producing storytelling shows. So I work with the storytellers in helping them
Mm,
in their stories. So that's a much more collaborative exercise and one I really enjoy.
yeah. Well, let's we can talk about it now. What the heck? We don't have to do this in a linear way. Tell me about storytelling. What you think about storytelling? Why is it so important, and so on.
Well, for me, so the storytelling that I do, I'm working on this project called Love Notes, which real stories by real people about real love. And that came to me during the darkest, loneliest period of my life. It was, after the dissolution of this 30-year marriage. And I was really despondent and disillusioned and thinking, like, does love even exist? And what does it look like? And I just I just really didn't even believe in love anymore. And being in the storytelling community, I produced some storytelling shows stories about motherhood, I put out a call to writers and actors and just regular people to share their true love stories. And so from that, people started sending me all these true stories. They had to be 1,000 words or fewer. And so to answer your question, like, what does storytelling do? In this case, I think storytelling, it's different than other mediums, like the personal essay or the novel. It's a testament. It's a first person testament. And what's really great when you see the different storytelling communities around the country is anybody can do it. And so that's part of the beauty of storytelling.
Mm-hmm. I think the key is, though, it has to be a genuine story. Making it up isn't the same thing.
Right. And that's the difference, right? Because people will write a short story or a story about something, but in storytelling, you're exactly right, Michael. It needs to be a true story. And that's what makes it so compelling and I think so relatable, is that people can see themselves in other people's stories. So like in my case, it was like the evidence, the proof of love, like what it really looks like as it walks around in the world.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like changed your view of love and that you believe in love again.
I do. And it and even like during the first season of Love Notes, because we do an off-Broadway show here in Manhattan, and we have an anthology, a companion anthology. I remember that first year, like I'd wake up in the morning and just like be not despondent, but upset, like, oh, like this doesn't happen. And then literally there was like a little voice in my head that would say, oh, well, don't you remember Stacy's story or Sarah's story? And it was like, just like the universe providing this evidence and this proof. And just hearing enough stories and story after story, yeah, it really did fortify my belief in love, and that love is for everyone, and it comes like from all these different angles and when you least expect it, and it shows up in so many different forms.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of merit to that. I know when I was writing this last book that I wrote, which is entitled Live Like a Guide Dog, True Stories from a Blind Man and His Dogs About Being Brave, Overcoming Adversity, and Moving Forward in Faith, I spent a lot of time talking about each of the 8 guide dogs that I've had, and the lessons I learned from them, and also using those lessons in the book to show the importance of different aspects of what happens in our lives. But I have maintained for years, I've learned a lot more about life and learned about leadership and teamwork. I've learned a lot more from these dogs than I ever learned from all the experts in the world. And that's primarily because, well, of some interesting observations. One, I allow my dogs to express themselves, but they also learn what the rules are, because dogs really want to hear from humans. They want humans to set the rules. They want humans to be the pack leaders by and large, and they want humans to be the ones to say, this is what I expect. But when that relationship forms, and it forms well, it's second to none. And you learn so much. Dogs love unconditionally, but they don't trust unconditionally, but they're open to trust, and we're not. And we really should learn to be more open to trust, and just so many different kinds of things. It has really given me a lot of pause to think over the past several years while we were writing the book. And I think about it now. There are a lot of neat stories in there that really ultimately are love stories in one way or another. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
Oh, that's so. I'm actually a new dog owner. Well, not too new. I'm for the first time in my adult life, have a dog, and I just, it's such a wonderful like experience, and it's opened me up to yeah, like so many different levels of love.
Yeah. Dogs want to establish a relationship, but as I said, I don't think that they are open to just trusting they do pretty much love unconditionally unless something just totally traumatizes them. But trusting is a different story. And that's a trust that has to be earned both ways. It's not just us earning their trust, but they're earning our trust. And the people who really take that to heart and develop that relationship and think about it find that they have a bond that's really second to none. It's as close a knit a team as you could ever find.
That's beautiful.
So it is a lot of fun. What kind of dog do you have?
I have, well, because remember, I'm in a small New York City apartment. I have a teacup poodle.
Oh, so it isn't a Saint Bernard. Okay.
And she's a character. She acts like she's a cross between a teacup and a pit bull when she's in the apartment. But when she's out on the street, she does not like, she's a scaredy cat on the street. She would prefer to be carried when we're on the street. So she's got sort of a split personality, but she doesn't take to many people. So just like you were saying, I can identify with that, like the whole trust element. And she only trusts a few people.
Yeah. Well, trust isn't something that happens overnight. I've maintained for a long time. I think it takes a good year for me when I am meeting a new guide dog. I think it takes a good year for the trust to become so seamless that we really know what each other is thinking. And I think that we really do understand each other. There's a lot of empathy there.
That's really great.
So I think it is kind of cool. Well, so, but going back to you getting married and all that, so you gave up for a while a lot of your dreams. That must have, whether it was conscious or not, been a little bit frustrating.
Yeah, and I didn't realize it at the time. It was only later, like when my younger self sort of came calling, and I'd given up a lot for this marriage that didn't really turn out the way I had hoped, so writing was a way for me to find myself again. And it was not only a refuge during that time in my life when I wasn't really happy, but it also really opened up that whole creative part of myself, which felt really good. And it's been something now I've been working on for the last decade and a half.
But it sounds like you didn't really, or at least consciously, you didn't really know that you were unhappy.
No, I didn't. And that's a really interesting observation that you make, because, I had my children, I loved my children, and I loved being a mom, and I had a really fulfilling career, but there was something missing, and I wasn't really able to put my finger on that until I started writing. And then it became more and more obvious that, this is the part that was missing. This, who you had thought you were going to be, a creative, you had denied that.
Yeah.
And you're right. So it wasn't really conscious, but like once it started to become more noticeable to me, then it sort of came back with a vengeance.
How much writing did you do before you got married?
Before, well, I really didn't, because I was more in the I read a lot. But I was more into the acting. So I didn't really, I would write some really bad poetry, but not anything. I know some writers will say, oh, they were writing from the time they were 6 years old, but it didn't come to me till much later.
So what got you started back writing after your marriage ended? What was the trigger that made that happen?
Actually, the writing and the marriage, it was like the last 10 years of my marriage, I was writing. And I sort of wrote my way out of the marriage in a way. But what was the trigger? And I do remember there was an absolute trigger. I had a friend who had self-published a book.
Okay.
It was like a friend of a friend. And one afternoon, it was a summer afternoon, we were over at her house because she had been hired to go to an elementary school and do a presentation. And so we were brainstorming. And about what she could do at this presentation. And I went home from that and I was like, well, I felt like so energized again. I was like, wow, well, I could do this. I could write a children's book. And so I sat down and I wrote this book called Beatrice Bumblebee is Busy. I didn't know anything about publishing. And I thought to myself, okay, well, now I'll just write it and I'll send it to publishers and I'll get it published. Well, it was promptly rejected by every single publisher. And I knew nothing about the publishing
Mm-hmm.
in that point. But it was enough of a spark. And then I did start just sort of playing around. And I had this scene in my head of a girl, like a young girl, who's been in a car accident and she's on the side of the road losing consciousness. And she has this terrible secret that she wants to tell her boyfriend. And this scene, it was like a dark, a wet Pennsylvania night. And it was in autumn and like I could see the mist. And so I had written this scene and I remember giving it to my father, who was a huge reader. And he's like, well, Heather, this is really good. Why don't you keep trying to work on it? And so I did. And I love school. So I was like, well, I don't know how to write. Like, how can I learn how to write? And then I sort of discovered, oh, well, there's these MFA programs. And so I ended up applying and going back to school. And then it was in my MFA program where I wrote the first draft of my first novel. But yeah, so the actual trigger was a friend who had self-published a book. And it really kind of triggered something in me.
Whatever happened to Beatrice Bumblebee is Busy?
She is in a drawer, but I have here on my bulletin board, I'll pull it down if we're on camera. I have this little bumblebee. It's like a rhinestone bumblebee that I keep stuck on my bulletin board as just a reminder that Beatrice has in my life.
Well, are you ever going to publish it?
Oh, I don't think it's very good, Michael.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe you should go back and rewrite it. But
Yeah, look then, or maybe if I have grandchildren someday, maybe I'll
there you
rewrite
go.
Bumblebee.
There you go.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting that you say that. Maybe I will go back and just look at it. It would be fun to look at it all these years later.
Yeah. Well, so you got rejected a whole bunch, which is a pretty common story. What did you learn from that?
Well, and I do talks at different places, and one of the talks I say is I start it with Calvin Coolidge said most of humanity's problems can be solved with two simple words: press on. And that's what I learned through the process. My first book was on submission for like 520 weeks before it finally found a publisher. And it was every degree of rejection that you can get when you're publishing. And for people who understand the publishing hierarchy, the coveted placement is to land a book deal with one of the big five traditional publishers. And then from there, it works its way down. And we had gotten close on some of the big fives and other places where we'd made it to acquisitions. And we finally ended up with a small indie publisher. But it took so long and it was so soul crushing in a way. And not so much the first book. And the first book, I was still like super, super hopeful. And then once it was published, it did go on and it won the National Indie Excellence Award. And I kind of was always thinking of it as a stepping stone. And that the second book would land the big publishing deal. And the second book took just as long, and it ended up right back with the same publisher. So the rejection taught me, that you just need to keep going. I mean, sometimes people hit really easily, or the way the wind's blowing that day, whatever's on trend or top of mind, and sometimes it doesn't, but you have to do it because you love it and you're called to do it.
When you were getting rejected, did you get any substantive feedback that helped, or do publishers do much of that?
Well, actually, I did, especially on my second book. And on the first book too. It depends how interested they are in the book. And I did have a couple that were pretty interested and gave what's called like an editorial letter. And oftentimes they won't even do that unless you're under contract. But I did have a couple that had liked it enough. So on my second book, especially, my agent and I then took that information and did some like hard edits and rewrites. But that's not always the case. I mean, I have a lot of friends who are also in the business. Sometimes you don't get any feedback.
Mm. And so now, altogether, how many books have you written?
Well, I've written two, and then I've edited and curated the anthology, the Love Notes anthology,
Right.
and I've written a small bit of that. Yeah, so I'd like to say three books.
Are there more books in you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
For sure. We have, well, first the second Love Notes edition, I'm definitely editing and curating the stories for that. And that's through a small publisher. And then I have been really sort of toying around with like, what's my next book? And my first two books were young adult romance, mystery, and thriller. And I kind of think I'm done with that genre. So I have talked about an adult fiction, or even a that would go kind of hand in hand with Love Notes, the my story type of book. Rebuilding after divorce and being on, what the space that Love Notes came out of, and going on, hundreds of dates and what that looked like. But that's in a very sort of nebulous state.
It will be fun to see what happens. You'll have to keep us all posted.
Yeah, for sure.
But you've described your creative journey, your whole creative journey is basically transforming heartbreak into healing. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, like I touched on earlier, Love Notes came out as sort of this really dark, lonely time in my life. My 30-year marriage had ended. My children had both left for college, and I'd relocated to New York City. So I was living alone for the first time in my adult life. It's the time I was 19 years old. And New York can be for as many people who live here, it can be a really lonely place.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really, really starting over. And I started dating at midlife. It's not for the faint of heart. And I was going on a lot of dates and just really discouraged by the whole process. And like I had sort of mentioned earlier, that's where I kind of was like almost indignant, like, but I want proof, like, show me proof that love is real. And that's where this call to like look for people's love stories came from. So I do say it truly came out of a place of loneliness and darkness, and then hope though too. I was hoping, I wanted the stories to give me proof. I wanted them to be the evidence. And then that sort of became a calling that, well, then I want to share that with other people and give other people hope. And that's been the most gratifying part for me, is when somebody, like, they come to the show, and the shows are really great, these storytelling shows. And now I've started to franchise them. So we have them popping up in some other cities, and I've gone around to some of the other cities. In fact, if you have any listeners who want to produce a Love Note show, but the audience members, they're like, oh, wow, this was, they don't expect it, first of all, coming into it. And everybody walks out feeling good. And that is like so gratifying to me, that like, in these like divisive times, that they can come to a show, they can recognize part of the human experience, and they can walk out feeling uplifted and hopeful. And then I've had some readers, in the book do that too, like having read the book, and someone will reach out and say, oh, well, that just really gave me hope. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
It does. So the two books that you've written are What the Valley Knows and The Lying Season. Tell me more about those. What the interesting titles, to say the least.
Yeah. Okay. So both books they're not a sequel and a prequel, but I would call them a series because they're both
Hmm.
set in this fictional town of Millington Valley, which is much like the small town I grew up in, the Ole Valley. And it's all set around this high school. So the peripheral characters in the books stay the same, like the English teacher and the principal. But the kids, because kids are only in high school for 4 years at a time, so different kids kind of like move through both of the books. Um, they're both mysteries or thrillers, and they both have like a big kind of like moral question at their center. Both set in this Millington Valley, which is a small Pennsylvania town.
Right. And um, they're they're for juveniles primarily, you said, I think, right?
Well, they are. They'd be considered young adult
Hmm.
fiction, but
Yeah.
essentially what the Valley knows, that's told from three point of views, two kids, and then one of the kids' mothers. So it has a lot of crossover appeal. So and that book originally started at six point of views. And that was when I was in graduate school. And I remember my professor saying to me, well, Heather, that's just too ambitious to try to do for your first book. You need to cut it down and just whoever's story has to be there. That's the point of view you include. And so it kind of fell into the young adult category by accident. Um, but I have a lot of adult readers who it really
Yeah.
resonates with them as well.
Yeah, I know a lot of people say, especially the early ones, the Harry Potter books are for more young adults and so on, but I certainly had no problem enjoying them as a full-fledged, real live, middle-aged adult. So I I I think there's a lot that we can learn by stretching and not necessarily just falling into the trap of reading one kind or one sort of book that's, oh, this is for more adults or this is more for children. I think there's a lot to be learned all the way around.
I think you're right, Michael. And it's kind of like a modern thing that we do, like classifying books as young adult or adult fiction. Like when we think about Catcher in the Rye, like what would that be considered now? Because the protagonist is a young adult. Would it be considered a young adult book? Um, but yeah, that's a really great point that you're making.
Well, so you you wrote these books and you said that they've been published and I assume they're out there. Do you know if they're audiobooks also?
Well, yes, but here's the thing. Because I didn't get to pick the publisher. I mean, I didn't get to pick the narrator. So
Mm,
they both, okay, so what the Valley knows is narrated. Yes. I don't like the narrator's voice. I know that's a terrible thing to say because I would love for people to go and listen to the audiobook, but I don't know. And maybe it's just me. And then the second book, the publisher actually used like an AI kind of
yeah.
um, I don't know exactly how it works, and I didn't really even know it happened till I went on Amazon one day. I was like, oh, they made an audiobook of this, and it was like an AI voice. So so the answer is yes, both of them are on audiobook. Love Notes is not, but the
Hmm.
other are.
It's interesting. I'm on several lists that deal with audiobooks and so on. And I hear people talking or emailing on the list all the time. And what people have often said is nonfiction books that are not what they're necessarily as much into as fiction books, they don't mind it being an AI voice. But when they're reading good fiction where they really want to be absorbed, AI and synthetic voices, text to speech just doesn't do it. And in fact, I buy into that. I agree with that. I don't think that we have yet gotten computer synthesized voices to really take the place of human readers. And I don't know that we ever totally will because we're so used to what people sound like. But it is an interesting thing that does come up.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So I prefer human readers in general. I've never been as great a fan of having a synthetic voice. Nothing against computers, but they just don't talk as well as humans do.
No, I agree with you too. I much prefer the human voice.
Well, so you when did you start writing love notes? When did that really start coming to fruition?
Well, Love Notes, we're coming into our third off-Broadway season this Valentine's Day. So it started that would we were in, so it started in 22.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So it's a relatively young project. We're going into our third year, but I'm super excited. We just cast the show for this upcoming performance, and that's really exciting. We have, a bunch of local New Yorkers, but then we also have about the cast is 12 members, and six of them are from other parts of the country. So it's got a, flavor from all over.
Now, is Love Notes available in any way online, or is it strictly just the shows and they're not recorded and
Oh,
disseminated
no.
in any way?
The All-Star Show, which is Valentine's Day at Symphony Space in New York City, the 8 p.m. show is live streamed. Yeah. So
Mm,
it can be enjoyed from anywhere in the world.
okay. But outside of that one being live streamed, are there recordings of any of the shows that are out there for people to hear?
There are on my website, actually, both the 2023 show and the 2024 show are available for resale. I think it's like $15. Um, and you can watch. It's a great like date night kind of thing to watch the Love Note show.
Okay. Well, so from all that you have heard and seen and interacted with in doing love notes, how do you define real love today?
Ooh, that's it.
How's
That's
that for a question out of left field?
yeah, that's a great question. How do I define real love? Hmm. So I think real love shows up in a lot of different ways. And it and what's interesting in Love Notes is I've seen all sorts of examples of it. I've seen the type of real love that ignites people when they're young,
Hmm.
real love. That's the other thing people will say, oh, well, you were too young. That's why it didn't work out. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I think a little bit sometimes is luck of the draw, but the I've seen examples of people who met when they were 20 years old and they've stayed together their entire lives.
Hmm.
And that shows up in commitment and the ability to grow up together and to grow and evolve together. So I think real love shows up like that. But I've also seen real love like the second time around type of love. And
Hmm.
that's a different sort of love where people really need to be able to integrate their past and understand they're both two people carrying bags. And now they're going to carry those bags together. And so that shows up in a different way, real love. And I've even seen it, love showing up for people like in their 80s, third time around, or having never had partnered and finding a partner very late in life. And that shows up in a whole different way that's absolutely real too. But I think at the core of all types of real love is one, the ability to both people have to want the
Yeah.
relationship and they have to be willing to work for the relationship. It's not just like what I want or you want, but it's oftentimes if they can ask the question, like, what's the problem and how are we a team against the problem or to be able to solve the problem? And I think that's sort of like the realist type of love that's out there.
And I would also say um, it goes back to something we talked about earlier with dogs. Um, Dogs are very much open to and do love unconditionally. And when we develop that kind of a relationship, it's as strong as any other kind of relationship that we can develop when both sides of that relationship sense it and know it. Um, it creates a bond that's, as I said earlier, second to none.
Yeah, that's a really great way of putting it.
I would I would not want to do anything to betray my guide dog, or any of the guide dogs that I've had, but I've learned how to create those teams, and I think that's very important. One thing that sticks in my mind dealing with dogs is when I lived in Northern California, we were very close to the Marin Humane Society, which is one of the more famous organizations of that type in the world. When we were talking to one of the people at the Marin Humane Society one day, and they were talking about the fact that they're growing in class sizes and growing in the number of classes that they have to offer. But what they also point out is that 90% of the training isn't training the dog, it's training the human, which is really true.
Right.
There's so much that humans don't really work to develop the relationship that they should. And if they really truly understood it, it would be a whole lot different relationship that they would experience.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of looking at it.
Well, so you have love notes that are growing by leaps and bounds in a lot of ways, and you have how many different places are doing the shows now?
Well, so far we have Indianapolis, Chicago, Reading, Pennsylvania, and then we have another Pennsylvania city, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And we're in talks right now with Atlanta, Georgia, and Tampa, Florida.
Wow. So it's growing.
It's growing. It's starting to spread. We're starting to spread some love.
I get it. What do you think about that?
I think it's great. Like I hope I'd love to see one in every city.
Mm-hmm.
Such a nice event that really brings the community together.
So how often do the shows run? Is it just like on Valentine's Day, or do they
So
go throughout the whole year?
it can be any time of year, and it's usually just a one-day event. Sometimes there's multiple shows on one day.
Okay.
But yeah, it's just a one-day event. Oftentimes the local producer will partner with a local charity. So we try to give back in that way too. And they can choose the charity they want, or sometimes they're trying to fund like a scholarship fund or something like that. I do encourage that. And we have like a mastermind group among the producers, just trying to support each other as creative entrepreneurs.
Well, you're seeing a lot of success with it. What kind of surprises have you experienced? This must be kind of a thrill and a lot of surprises for you.
Well, one of the surprises, well, I'm not surprised by it anymore, but I'm certain, always surprised when I have a cast member who at the very last minute, they've gone through all the rehearsals, all the prep work, all the editing, and then at the very last second, they pull out of the show. I've had that happen each show. So now I know how to plan for it, and I know how to prepare, producers for it. But yeah, that's always surprising to me.
Mm. It's an adventure, isn't it?
Sure is. Yeah. You got to
So,
think quickly on your feet.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You definitely have to do that. Tell us a little bit about Sock Rock, the company you and your brother formed, and what that's all about.
Sure. Well, my brother was a professional soccer player, and when he retired, he moved to Manhattan thinking he was going to be an actor. And as most actors go, they need a second job to support themselves.
Yeah.
So he became a personal trainer, and he was personal training, and some of his clients got word that he'd been a professional soccer player. And they begged him, they're like, can you teach our kids soccer? So it kind of happened by accident. And he started with just a few balls and cones in Central Park, teaching soccer to little kids. And over the years, it's grown and grown and grown and grown. We're in our like 20th year. And so it was like maybe 5 years ago, it just got out of hand. Like it was getting too big and he needed help. And that was when I had gone through the divorce, and I like explained I'd been in business before and I wanted a change. So he offered me, a position to come and help him and run. So I run the business side of the soccer and he runs the soccer side. And we're all throughout Manhattan. We do public classes in the parks and playgrounds. And then like now in the wintertime, we rent space all around the city. And then we also partner with private schools and public schools throughout the city. And we do birthday parties and personal training. And we're starting a Kids of All Abilities program. And that's like our new initiative right now. And then the spring, we're expanding into basketball too. BB Rock, we're calling it.
Ooh, that's cool. Well, you're doing a lot of different things. You speak, you're an author, you're an educator. We haven't talked about, I guess it's, you work with SUNY?
Yeah, I teach at the City University of New York, which is part of SUNY. Mm-hmm. And that work I really love. Yeah.
Tell me about that then.
So they have an initiative. It's through the Manhattan Educational Opportunity Center, and SUNY provides grants for adult students returning who need to get their high school equivalency, their GED. So I teach writing, the writing section of the GED, and these are the students I like the most. And I've taught at all levels, from freshman comp all the way up to graduate level MFA. And it's the GED adult student that I enjoy the most. So when I'm done with you, I actually will Zoom up to Harlem, and I'll be teaching GED tonight.
Ooh, okay. Well, you're doing all of these different things. How do you keep yourself grounded, and how do you keep the creative juices going?
Well, that can sometimes be a challenge.
I'll bet.
But I exercise. That's one thing I love to exercise. And I'm getting better at just taking time for myself. But I also feel like what I do isn't work. Like, I enjoy what I do. So I always try to bring a sense of gratitude to each day in that way.
Yeah. Well, and taking time for yourself is important to do. And now you have a teacup poodle to share it with, and I'll bet you guys have some interesting conversations.
Yeah, we sure do. She's a cutie. She's just lying on the little chair right over here.
Yeah, my dog is over here on his bed, so he monitors me.
Yeah, she's been really good, because sometimes when I'm on the Zoom like this, she'll start to bark. She doesn't like paying attention to somebody else.
Well, one of these days we'll have to end up in Manhattan and come and meet her.
That sounds great.
I think it'd be kind of fun.
That sure would.
Well, so tell me, what's next for you? What do you envision going forward from here?
Well, my hope is actually, I would love, because I have so much fodder now, all these different stories, love stories. My hope is to launch a podcast, a Love Notes podcast, that would feature the storyteller and their story. And then I would do an interview of the story behind the story, because people always have questions. They'll hear a story or they'll read the story, and it's really short. It's like 700 or 1,000 words. And they'll always want to know, like, well, what happened then? Or how did that end up? So I envision this podcast of Love Notes, real stories by real people about real love. And that would be like the meat of it. And then there at the end of each one, there'd be like a love letter, and people could write love letters that would be shared on the podcast and tell,
That's cool.
Like, dear Michael, this is why I love you. And then it would be a letter. So I'd like to see more satellite cities. I'd like to get the next edition of the book out and then launch the podcast. My trifecta.
Lots going on, no, needless to say. Well, if people want to reach out to you, talk about creating their own love notes, or as you said, you'd love to find people who want to help produce in various cities, how do they do that?
Well, probably the easiest thing to do is, first, if they just want to learn more about the project in general, would just be to check out the website. And that's at www.lovenotesworldwide.com. And from there, then you can you can get a hold of me, but I'll give my email address also. It's Heather at Heather Christie, CHRISTIE books.com. So either just hit the website or send me an email directly. And I'd love to talk to anybody who's got a story they want to share, or anyone who's thinking like maybe they'd love to bring a love notes to their community.
Cool. Well, I hope people will reach out and that you'll get lots of interest from our podcast. It's a fun thing, and I hope that people will respond. So all of you out there, email Heather.
That sounds great. And my last little plug, if anybody would love to watch the Love Note show on February 14th for Valentine's Day, you can find that information on the website too.
I'm trying to remember what day of the week February 14th is going to be in 2026.
Saturday. It's a Saturday.
Saturday. Great day to do it.
Yeah, so you can watch it. And actually, the live stream will stay live for a week. So if you're not able to watch it that night, you can watch it during the week.
Oh, cool. Well, I hope people will do that. And I want to thank you for being here, but I want to thank all of you out there for being a part of this today. Heather has had a lot of interesting things to say, and I hope that you'll help her and help yourself by helping her to be more successful. I'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please feel free to email me at michaelhi@accessibe.com. That's michaelhi@accessibe.com. We'd love it and would greatly appreciate it if wherever you are listening or watching the podcast, if you'll give us a 5-star review, but also, or a rating, but also give us a review. We love reviews. We appreciate reviews. And we really value all the people who have done it so far, and we ask that you do it again, or you do it for the first time. So please let us know what you think by writing reviews. If you know anyone who ought to be a guest, we'd love it if you'd let us know. Heather, you as well. Anyone that you think ought to be a guest on Unstoppable Mindset, we would really love to be introduced. My belief is everyone has stories to tell, so don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you. But Heather, once again, I want to thank you for being here. This has been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's been so much fun to talk to you this afternoon.
If you're ready to go deeper into the ideas that shape how we see ourselves and others, I have a free gift for you. Head over to michaelhingson.com and download my free ebook, Blinded by Fear. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep choosing to live with an unstoppable mindset.